All right, we'll go ahead and get started. On behalf of the College Counseling Office, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our annual Dean's Panel. We're very excited to welcome three experts in the field of higher education, admission and enrollment, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves and their schools in just a moment. But before I do that, I'd like to remind everybody that you are encouraged to pose questions for our panelists through the course of the hour using the Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of your screen. My colleague Stuart Titus and I will monitor your questions as they come in, and while we may not get to all of your questions, our hope is to address a broad range of current topics in higher education, and we certainly know there are no shortage of topics to discuss at this time. So I do have a series of questions that we received in advance, but I'd like to start us off with a bit of a softball. I wonder if each of our panelists would take a moment to introduce themselves and to introduce your college or university as well. And I suppose we can start with Leigh.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for that warm welcome, Mike. It's nice to be with you all virtually. My name is Leigh Weisenburger, and I'm Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Bates College. Bates is a selective liberal arts institution located in Lewiston, Maine. So just geography-wise, to orient you, we're about 2 hours north of Boston, or depending on where in the world you are, about 5 hours south of Montreal. So we have a unique history. I'll keep my remarks brief. But we were founded by idealists who wanted to make sure that educational opportunities were open to all students regardless of their background. So as such, we began as a co-ed institution. So we've been coeducational since 1855. We've also never had any fraternities or sororities, where our founders really saw those organizations as potentially creating divides and borders within our community. And I would say most importantly, our founders made a really clear and public statement that we wouldn't discriminate based upon race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, which if you dial back 150 plus years ago, that was radical to say the least. So those ideals, those principles of inclusion, access, inclusion, and excellence have been in our DNA since day one. So we'll talk later, I'm sure, about ways in which that's alive and well in modern day Bates, but that's just a little insight to the college. So thank you, Mike.
All right, Renee.
Good evening, and thank you all for having me here. I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. My name is Renee Turner, and I serve as Vice Provost for Admission and Student Financial Services at Washington University in St. Louis. Obviously, our location is in our name. We are in St. Louis, Missouri, in the middle of the country. WashU is a selective research university. We have over 90 programs in 4 academic divisions, including a School of Business, McKelvey School of Engineering, Arts and Sciences, of course, and we have programs in art and architecture in our Sam Fox School. Many people know WashU because of our outstanding medical school and our medical faculty who are doing all kinds of wonderful research and patient care. And so we think of ourselves as an institution that's about teaching, learning, and patient care. We are a community. While we have about 7,000 undergraduate students on our campus, we consider ourselves a really close-knit community. Our unofficial motto is that we know our students by name and story. So faculty and staff take that seriously and work really hard to connect with our undergraduate students to make sure that they have the support, guidance, and advice that they need throughout their time at WashU. And it's we have a fairly large campus. We are a teeny bit of our campus is in the city, and the other part is in St. Louis County, so it feels like a little suburban neighborhood, but it's a beautiful, beautiful campus, and lots of opportunities at WashU, and I'll stop there.
All right, and Rick.
All right, well, looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me. My name is Rick Clark. I'm the Director of Admission at Georgia Tech, which I think you can actually see part of this US map that we ended up putting up because clearly our kids in Virtual Clerk Academy do not know much about US geography. So had to actually bring the map in. Located in Atlanta, Georgia, kind of midtown if you've been in or through town, where business and residential sort of meet together. So really an interesting spot. And actually, I could go into kind of history or other things, but I was in a meeting earlier today. It's super interesting about what's happening in Atlanta. And Georgia Tech sort of sits right there by the highway. So a lot of people have been by it. I call those drive-by visits, and I don't recommend them. But I think that between North Avenue and 10th Street, so like 0 and 10th Street, there is a project that's underway, and it's just receiving funding called the CAP, where they're actually going to build up and over the highway and create a park, actually, like right through basically the middle of downtown Atlanta, like a 10-block park over the highway, which abuts our campus. It'll really be transformational. So pretty interesting to kind of see that project move along. And it's an interesting way where Georgia Tech, a lot of civil engineers, partnering with government and private corporations to really, I think, do something pretty significant for the city.
Great. Now, I'm reminded through your introductions that you each represent very distinct universities, and for that reason, you likely adhere to distinct admission practices as well. So I'm wondering, to kind of start the evening here, if you would each take a moment to briefly describe your application review process. What happens after an application is submitted, and ultimately, at the risk of asking you to oversimplify, how are admission decisions made?
I can start if you'd like, Mike. So I think, yes, there likely are differences between the three institutions, given we each are different in size and mission and program, yet I think it will be interesting to hear that there also likely are similarities that might pleasantly surprise some folks, so to say. So at Bates, we have 3 rounds of admission. We have 2 rounds of early decision, which are binding admission programs, and then we have a regular decision program, which is not binding. But regardless of when a student applies, they can apply through 2 avenues. There's the common application and the coalition application. And then we read in-house, we practice what's called CBE, or committee-based evaluation. So what that means is we actually read with a partner. So it would mean that Mr. Titus and I would take an application, and he might be responsible for the academic portion of the application, and I would be responsible as the passenger for the co-curriculars, other elements, the writing, what have you, in the application. So how that functions in practice is it's sort of a mini committee, if you will. So you're both actively reading the application, but you're also rendering a decision as a duo rather than solely on your own without having dialogue with a colleague who might have a different perspective or ask different questions. So when we actually read the application functionally, that's how we read it. We read it on screen, stating probably the obvious things here, but we read electronically there. And all of our applicants have the opportunity to make it to what we call full committee. So while an admission decision is rendered in that CBE, and we spend the vast majority of what is committee, where the entire admission team of readers get around, at least pre-COVID, around a table. We'll see how this plays out in the coming weeks. We would get around the table and discuss applicants. We typically discuss those that were still questioning their admissibility. However, anybody can be brought forward if the readers wish to make their colleagues aware of their candidacy. The last detail I'll just offer is we practice what's called holistic admission. So that we really take into account all elements of the application. So it's not as if we strictly take the numbers in, whether that be GPA or rank or testing. Bates is test optional and has been so for over 35 years. But we take in all of those academic marks along with the writing, the recommendations, again, the co-curriculars, to see the whole person, where we are looking to bring students to a living and learning community, not just a learning community, nor just a living community. So I'll let my colleagues chime in and share how it works at their respective institutions.
This is always the awkward part. You're never sure who's going to go next. But I'll jump in, and we'll try very hard not to be repetitive, because Leigh said a lot of things that are very similar to the way that we approach our work at WashU. We also have 3 rounds of decisions, plus we work with a program called QuestBridge. So we consider it 4 rounds, but 2 rounds of early decision 1, 2, and then regular decision. Our approach at WashU is every application is read or evaluated with at least 2 sets of eyes. Two different team members will take a look at that application. Every application goes through a committee. WashU, I mentioned in my introduction that we have 4 academic divisions. We make admissions decisions into, we decide to admit a student into a particular academic division or major to which they've applied. So often we have faculty or deans from those different academic divisions that will sit in and be a part of the committee as we are finalizing decisions. And that's, many schools still have faculty or deans sitting in, but it is, I think it's rarer than these days than it is the norm. And for us, we're really focused on that preparation for each academic division, as well as the students' interest, that genuine interest in what they're telling us at this time that they're interested in studying. And so that nuance really impacts the final decisions at WashU.
All right. Yeah, I mean, rounding it out, we use a similar process. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago about CBE. This was like maybe the year after it came out. And, you know, my personal opinion was there was kind of a bit of shoddy journalism. You know, they kind of short shifted it a little bit. And Georgia Tech didn't come out looking great on that one. So we changed our acronym, do the same thing, but we call it PBR now, just because it's better swag anyway. But that is partner-based review. So, you know, I think a lot of people think that committee means pearls and big wooden oaken tables and, you know, people who, I don't know what they think, honestly. But it's not that, whatever they think. It's, you know, people with like North Face vests on that have Instagram accounts making decisions, which could be terrifying. Nonetheless, for us, we don't have 7 people sitting around deliberating. It's often partners. And similar to as Leigh and Renee described, those partners have a conversation. And the driver, as Leigh said, kind of owns a geographic territory. And we move throughout making decisions, and then we go into layered review. So we call that cohort review. And, you know, I think the piece that, and we can talk more about this, I'm sure, but, you know, the piece that really drives cohort review is our institutional priorities. You know, and to give you a really specific example, and maybe a difference, well, a definite difference between Georgia Tech and the other schools represented is we're a public institution. And as a public institution, you know, one of the institutional priorities is to represent Georgia within our classes over the majority of, you know, beyond 50%, usually closer to 60%. Not legislated, but definitely, you know, something that's in classic Georgia politics style, like a backroom deal. And, you know, we try to walk that line. And so basically, that comes into play. Those institutional priorities come into play as you're making admission decisions and in cohort review. You know, women, you know, one of the things Georgia Tech certainly does, and other institutions too, is responds to corporations and hiring. And, you know, definitely a good 7-10 years ago, corporations were coming and saying, we need more women at the table, you know, when it comes to policy making, when it comes to product creation. And so in responding to that, I mean, as an institutional priority, everything from recruitment to cohort review to the way decisions fall out, women in STEM, you know, has become an institutional priority, and it influences the whole process. So Again, we can talk more in detail about that, but essentially that's kind of the way the process works.
Great, thank you all. Rick, the notion of institutional priorities is one that we often speak with our students and our families about, particularly when we're trying to provide context for some of the admission decisions that they might receive. And I'm curious from the group, and maybe I can direct this question specifically to Renee, since you've been able to speak to this a little bit already, but in a given moment, have your institutional priorities shifted or changed by necessity as a result of the pandemic? We know prior to this year, for instance, a number of colleges have said that they were prioritizing enrollment of first generation and Pell eligible students. Is that sustainable? And how have your institutional priorities been impacted by the pandemic?
I think that that's a great question, Mike. I think I have a boring answer. I think our institutional enrollment priorities have really not shifted. I will admit that last March, after decisions were released and COVID hit, and none of us really knew or understood the impact of COVID, of the pandemic, we were asked to bring in a slightly larger class, and we worked hard to do that, and we admitted students from the wait list, but our priority was still to enroll first generation students from low socioeconomic backgrounds or Pell eligible. That is a huge institutional commitment. But we are also, because of our academic divisions, we're also trying to meet enrollment goals for different academic divisions. They have size targets that they ask us to meet. But no, we have not changed our institutional priorities. We have in fact added more financial aid this past year in order to support families that may have been going through some challenges as a result of COVID. And we expect to continue to be able to support our current students as well as our incoming students for the next fall's class. So no real changes for us.
Leigh, I would actually be interested in hearing your response to that question as well.
Sure. So I don't believe I mentioned size. Bates is on the smaller scale of the institutions represented tonight. So we have about a first 500 students in our first year class. And my answer though is still boring like Renee's, in that at this juncture, we have not received any directive to shift institutional priorities or enrollment goals. I will say though, just to be realistic, given the pandemic, we're curious to see what our pool looks like, our applicant pool. Bates tends to draw a number of non-US citizens in our pool, upwards of 30%, given that we provide full aid to non-US citizens. So we're curious to see if those students are interested in us, think it's viable for them to study in the States. And then geography will also be interesting. And I don't want to tie everything to travel, but I think for some students, Maine is an adventure and something that they're up to and they're excited about. But perhaps in this world, families maybe not wanting or not feeling the freedom to travel in the same way. Thus far, we haven't seen it deter students that have expressed interest in the college, but we're just curious to see what the pool shakes out to be. So nothing changing in terms of institutional priorities, but I think January 1's a ways away.
One of the trends that we've observed, and Northeastern was actually quite transparent recently in admitting that they are likely to enroll a much greater portion of their freshman class through early decision. And so I'm curious, and I'm actually happy to have Rick maybe respond to this first, but will that be a larger trend this fall? Do you anticipate that schools will be filling a larger portion of their class through the early rounds, specifically early decision and early action?
That would be my guess. Whoa, sorry about that. Yeah, I would guess that will be the case. Honestly, my big prediction though is just that there's going to be way more admits out there, period. And Leigh alluded to this, certainly with the international side of things. Well, and I should say too, like for publics, healthy publics are under a lot of pressure from their systems to grow because, the financial hit of COVID, is significant in higher education. And if you're a private school, of course, that's very locally controlled and felt. As a public, as part of a system, sometimes you carry other schools within the system. And so, flagships and flagship-like schools around the country are going to be under pressure to grow, I think, on the public side, which means more admits, period. Also, because the international population, this is more speaking for Georgia Tech, so I'd have to have either my colleagues, say if this is accurate for them or not, but our experience is that international students often apply in regular, a much higher percentage than they do early, even though we don't have a binding process. It's early action, not early decision. This year in particular, I think that will be true because of watching the virus, looking at visa issuance, and frankly, watching the results of the election. And so what that means, at least for us, is domestic non-residents, non-Georgia students who need to, again, make up about 40% of the class. We're going to be planning on international students who usually are at about 10% of that being a smaller percentage. And right now we're setting that at about 7. Not hard to tell if that's realistic or not. So 33% then for domestic non-resident students, a much higher percentage of those than represented in early action. Therefore, more admits in early action to make up a higher percentage of the class for domestic non-residents. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily representative of either the schools on this particular call or schools across the country, but in talking to some other publics like us, they're saying very similar things.
Similarly, we have a question from a parent in thinking about the way that we're shaping the class and that you all are shaping the class. We've heard from some parents and students who are concerned about the impact of deferrals and gap years. And in the conversations that we've had, the impact seems likely to vary based in part on the size of the institution, but it does seem that many colleges are planning for a slightly larger first-year class to guard against the uncertainty that the pandemic has caused. Do you plan to maintain similar enrollment goals to last year? And Rick, you've already sort of spoken to that intent potentially to increase your enrollment, but Leigh and Ronne, I'd be curious to have your input as well.
I can say we were doing the dance of who's going to talk, so excuse us. I can say quickly that size-wise, first-year class, we don't intend to shift that. If anything, grow a bit, just given the uncertainty, as we've alluded to thus far. I think the piece that remains a big question is, yes, we did see an uptick in gap year students, but the stickiness, if you will, that is the big question mark. So they're not necessarily going to persist and enroll with 100% certainty, given that they understandably made the decision to take a gap year under extenuating circumstances. So we respect them, we're excited, we're hopeful they'll arrive, but there's a massive question mark, I'd say, there as a data point. So we're gonna move along with same numbers, same targets as we would have historically.
I want to add that we are kind of working a little bit in the dark. All of the things that have happened in the past, the way our applications built, the number of students that we could admit to, that we would then be able to yield our class. There's so much that's up in the air right now. We don't know how students and families are reacting to COVID. And Leigh alluded to the fact that we don't know if students and families will want to travel and send their child longer distance from home, or what we don't know what that means. And so we are all pretty anxious trying to figure out what is happening this year with our applicant pools. To answer a little bit of the question that you asked, Rick, our intention at this point is to have the same percentage of ED students in our class. At WashU, it's been pretty high. Consistently, it's been close to 60%. That is our intention, but we don't know if that intention will be fulfilled. It all depends upon the applicant pool. And so all of those things that we are worried about. The other thing that I can't give you a definitive answer about the size of our entering first year class, because we are meeting now with our provost, and we have to meet with the chancellor and have them agree to our proposal, our model of what we think. And the other thing is we need to understand what our current student enrollment is. WashU, we started 2 weeks later than our semester was supposed to start, and we started later than everybody else because we were really trying to understand the pandemic and try to prepare our campus. So we're just getting lots of data to understand what our current student enrollment is. If I have to guess, I think our class is going to be a little larger, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And frankly, I don't know if I'm going to know for sure until January, when we understand the impact of the way we're delivering our coursework right now and how that's impacting current students. So I hope that all made sense.
Yes, it did. Thank you. We do have a parent actually who's asking a question to that effect in terms of how you would assess the quality of the virtual experience for some, but the experience of being educated on campus or off through this time period. And what might your schools have learned about how to improve the educational experience on the whole? So I know that's a sort of broad in scope, but I'm curious to have your perspective in terms of the experience of those students who are living it. And Rick, maybe if you'd like to jump in.
Sure, happy to. And just to clarify, we're talking about on our campuses, what we're learning. Okay. So, in contrast to WashU, Georgia Tech and a lot of schools in the South, started early to mid-August. So we certainly have been on campus and, working through figuring out how to do this well. One thing that has made, I guess, national and international news over the last couple of years is Georgia Tech's graduate program in computer science. It's a fully online program, and it's made a lot of news because it's $7,000 for a master's in computer science online. And that was pretty disruptive within that space. And so in launching that, we certainly, I think, were somewhat ahead of the game with kind of the delivery and the infrastructure from a hybrid or purely online delivery standpoint. Well, and I'm not perfect, and a lot of our professors had never taught, online, but the infrastructure was there and the expertise on campus was there to do that well, to move curriculum, to move instruction, to move conversation and, grading and all of these things, right? So we spent a lot of time over the summer having our experts teach, others who basically, as I'm sure you all did their absolute best in the spring, right? Just to kind of duct tape it together and make it through. What we are, and we're still doing that, still learning, still trying to make it better. But what I'm finding now is it's the education between the buildings that that's missing. It's the fact that these kids are picking up, pre-made boxes of food and going back to cinder block rooms, and that's not what college is really supposed to be. And that's not the best campus experience. And so for us, we're really starting to focus on the spring and how do we, enhance that type of interaction, dialogue and opportunities. Like we just actually purchased, I can't remember, about 100 tents. Big tents to put outside for students to have recitation classes for this semester, but then also for next semester to actually have instruction. And so, you know, those are just some of the things, I guess, that we're looking at and thinking about and trying to get right. Just to break this down for you, 10% of our classes are fully in person. 30% of our classes are fully online, and the other 60% are some hybrid mix, which is everything from twice a week to a couple times a semester. But that's sort of how it's breaking down right now.
Ronne, a moment ago, oh, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to just jump in really quickly and just kind of say that I had a lunch meeting today. So every week there's a group of undergraduate deans, and these are the staff that really oversee all of the advising. They do a lot with students to make sure students are okay. They work with faculty and all of those things. So every week they get together and they have lunch, and they typically are talking about any issues, any challenges. I have a student that has this, how do we make this work, all of those things. And they let me crash every now and then, which is really great. and so today was my day to crash. And so I asked the question of how our course is going. And you know, they talked about the fact that the faculty had so much time over the summer to prepare that they were able to, I don't know if re-engineer is the right word, but redesign their classes, and that students are enjoying their classes. I think we probably have a similar mix as Georgia in terms of in-person, hybrid, and remote. So students are enjoying their classes, but it's trying to beef up the opportunities for students to engage with each other, particularly the first year students. The second year students, the third and fourth year students, they have friends, they have a cohort. I think they're managing a little bit better. And so just trying to beef up those opportunities for first year students to connect with each other. Their transition, I think, is going to be longer than it typically is for first year students.
Now, we know we're trying to make those connections among first-year students as well, but you all are also working to connect with prospective students. And I know this may be for some in the distant future, but some are beginning to plan for how they reopen their college campuses to admission visitors. And we're thinking about once students have departed in late November through some of the breaks where our students are typically leaving Mercersburg Academy and have the opportunity to travel and see college campuses. When might families see campuses reopen to prospective students and their families? And Leigh, I wonder if you know, Maine, you mentioned earlier, has not necessarily been impacted in quite the same way that much of the country has by the pandemic. So I wonder if that is informing your plans for reopening campus to visitors.
Sure, thanks for the question. So while Maine has fared relatively well in light of the pandemic, I think in reaction to that, we're looking to keep the place as safe as we possibly can. So right now, we are not slated to welcome visitors to campus any sooner than January. And I think it's less and less likely that we will open up that early. So we hope to make a decision on that in about mid-November, where it's a pretty big programmatic shift. You can't just flip a switch, where there would have to be all sorts of regulations and guidelines that we would adhere to. So this by no means is an easy decision, and it's really challenging for admission staff in particular, where we just love and feed off of interactions with prospective students and families. But right now, and I hope this doesn't come across selfishly, our top priority is protecting the health and safety of our current students and our faculty and staff. So that's number one. So right now, closed at least until January, TBD thereafter.
Yes, real quick for Georgia Tech, and you know, we have an Atlanta enrollment consortium group. So this includes Emory, Morehouse, Spelman, Georgia State, Agnes Scott, you know, pretty decent cross section of higher education. And we're all in the same boat, actually. It's nobody's having in-person, guests at this point. And the realistic goal, I think, is yield programs for admitted students. I just think based on timing, January and February, from what we know and what we don't know about the pandemic, and what we know and what we think we know about, just risk and spread and those seasons, probably going to continue a lot like it looks right now, I think, with a real hope for those critical March, April timeframes to get back to hosting in some creative way admitted students for yield.
Yeah, we're very hopeful that for our senior class who hasn't had the opportunity to visit that in the spring, they'll be able to do so, to choose from among the options they've been accepted to in order to make an informed decision. And we know that's an important part of their process that they've missed. We do have a question from a parent that speaks to this challenge of not being able to form that connection. And it's particularly about picking up on the vibe of campus, which, those prescriptive produced videos don't necessarily allow students the opportunity to really identify that vibe. So if a student is really eager to learn and get to know the school in that way, Ronne, maybe would you speak to the various opportunities students have to do that?
Yes, I think that we're all working really hard to be creative and to try to find ways for students to understand the culture or the vibe, if you will, of our different campuses. And I know one of the ways that we try to do that at WashU is we really try to create programs that involve current students. So even if they are virtual Zoom programs, we have lots of current students involved. We've been getting faculty involved. We have a student hosted or student guided virtual tour. So while they're showing them around virtually, they're telling them about the culture and how they spend their time and all of those things. So I think those things, we're getting better at it, and I think those things can help. But I also think that students and families need to use their resources. I'm going to say social media, but I think you have to take social media with a grain of salt. But social media, I think you need to check in with alums, students that you know who attended Mercersburg and then are at those institutions, to really talk with them and to get a sense of the vibe. But I think that we are doing a much, much better job. And I think that students are finding ways to distinguish our institutions just by the programming, the virtual programming, the online, connecting with alums, all of that stuff that we've been offering for students. It's hard, but I think it's doable.
I just wanted to say one thing about social media. I think social media for good, and if I was a student looking at Mercersburg and I couldn't visit, I would be looking at what's being put out there. I'd be calling people that I know who have some affiliation and trying to just talk to as many different people as I can. But, one thing I would tell families is it's fine and good to look at like the big accounts for the institution or even the admission account for the institution. But, we'll put out some seriously Photoshopped stuff. It's going to be the glossy, shiny stuff. We'll definitely touch things up. The kid was never wearing a Georgia Tech hoodie, in Barcelona. We just Photoshop that in. So, I think what I tell people is, they need to, if they're interested in club baseball, go find the Snapchat for club baseball team, because they have no idea you're looking. They're talking to each other. That's honest stuff. And it's organic. And, I think that's really valuable. So I'm not saying never look at the admission stuff. I'm not saying never look at the big account, but dig deeper, I guess, and just try to round out your perspective. That's always going to be helpful.
I'm going to mess with Rick. Photoshopping is a myth. We don't do that anymore. We got in trouble years ago for that. We don't do that.
We didn't get the memo.
I was going to say Bates does not participate. The piece I would add to that we've seen, and this threads a couple of the questions, our faculty have been really pleased with how focused our students are. Now, that's not to say they're not involved in extracurriculars, and the college is doing a fantastic job finding programming, but it's been interesting to watch our students find themselves here with a real intellectual seriousness. Not to say they didn't have it before, but there just aren't the distractions. So I say that to say, I think we're also hearing that a little bit from high school students as we interact with them, that they're like, I don't have all these activities to list. And it's like, that's okay. That means you're focusing on your schoolwork. So not knowing all that's occurring at Mercersburg, but I imagine some of that is the case. So I say this to say, also dig, yes, I'm with you, the social media, sort of the 3-level down accounts are important, but also really dig into faculty pages. Don't just read like the opening paragraph for the psych department or the opening paragraph for chemistry. Go in. I didn't know what a CV was when I was 17, and I'm not expecting you to read these 10-page CVs, but just go and see what the faculty have posted. And many of them, they're younger than me now, and they've got their own, either social media or YouTube page or whatever it might be. And you can see, oh, wow, they're real. They're somebody I could connect with, and maybe reach out to them. Admittedly, they're a little slammed as they're, navigating this new world as well, but they're eager to know who their future students are. This is their future as well, and the vitality of the institution. So if you've got a real question, write them. I wouldn't say, hey, can you tell me about the English department? But if they've got something a little more specific that aligns with your interests, you can probe a bit and just try and start a dialogue there.
Leigh, that's also good advice, I think, for students when they're answering that supplemental question for a school that's asking why whoever, right? Why Bates? Dig a couple down, right? And look at faculty and stuff. And also in preparation for interviews. Because, anybody who interviews people for jobs or anybody who interviews people for admission or scholarships, like, that question is coming of like, what questions do you have for us, right? That is coming. And it should not be level 1, like, what's your mascot type of question. So getting down is important for that as well, I think.
That's all great advice. I think sometimes, it is the content that's not necessarily designed with the prospective student in mind that holds the most value. And we try to push our students in that direction when we can. And fortunately, our students are pretty receptive to that advice. Related to all this is this notion of demonstrated interest, right? And how it is that students are articulating a connection to the schools that they're applying to. And Rick, you just spoke to the supplemental question that so many of our students see: why Georgia Tech, or why whatever college it is that they're applying to. In the absence of the college visits and given the Zoom fatigue that some of our students might be experiencing, how is it that they form that connection, and how is it that you are all kind of recalibrating the ways in which you account for demonstrated interest? And Rick, if you wouldn't mind starting us off maybe, and then
sure.
You're welcome to jump in.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, we're not really a school that has ever put a lot of stock in that. I mean, an application is demonstrated interest for us. So we're not tracking, visits the reason we track it so we can communicate, right? We track it so that what we say makes sense. If you came to visit, or if we visited you at your school, then, you're kind of entering a communication flow that's different, but that's not impacting admission decisions. What I would say is that I definitely agree with what Leigh's saying. I mean, faculty and others on campus are, as with your campus, I mean, trying to figure things out and frenzied in a lot of ways. However, I also think, and what I am hearing from colleagues and also from students is, I think that higher ed is also kind of in panic mode too. I mean, the concept of enrollment and, we're just going to get our class, even for the healthiest schools, is, I think, in a lot of ways out the window. And so, people know that they need to reach, they need to be available when students reach out to them, and they want to be. And I think in the past they've wanted to be, but I think this year in particular, everyone is acutely aware of the fact that enrollment matters more than it's ever mattered before. And so I would just say for students, and I know you all counsel your students this way, being proactive in reaching out and being able to, whether it be with current students, faculty, advisors. I mean, advisors are often some of the best folks to get some insights from as well. So yeah, I would say demonstrated interest also, and you all are the experts on this, I think, more so than I am, but schools that use it say it. Schools that use it are pretty transparent about that fact. And so when it comes to admission decisions with demonstrated interest, I think you guys are the experts to inform and counsel students on how to do that best.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because WashU has traditionally been a school that used demonstrated interest, that we were really interested in students who, in the admissions process, we really wanted students to have visited us or have communicated with us at a high school visit or a college fair, because for us, we thought it was really important that students know who we are. Like if you're in the Midwest, you know St. Louis, but if you're on either coast, you may not know St. Louis or Missouri. And so we really believe that if students had the opportunity to get to know us, the more they know us, the more they love us. And so, so we liked that and we tracked it. We still track if you are engaging with us virtually, but I will admit we've been having a discussion in our office in this last week about eliminating demonstrated interest from the admissions process, at least this year, because we feel like it's contributing a lot to the stress that students are having around this process. We want students to continue to explore us, but we're really talking about this. I think we've made the decision not to. We're working on a communication, and if you are a student that is thinking about WashU and you're in our prospect list and you're getting information from us, you will get this communication once it goes out. My whole point in telling you this is that COVID and this pandemic is making all of us think about what we do and why we do it, and try to figure out what is fair for students right now, given the diversity of experiences that students are having all over the country, all over the world. And we are sensitive, we care, and all of us in our own way are rethinking things. And I hope that students and parents will relax a little bit and calm down a little bit, and trust your counselors here to help you navigate a bit, and know that we understand that this is unusual and what you're experiencing is unusual, and we're going to take that into consideration as we're making our admissions decisions.
Leigh, I wonder if, as schools are moving beyond demonstrated interest, perhaps, certainly you've been test optional for quite some time, but some schools are introducing test optional policies for the first time. Based on some of the conversations you've had with colleagues at other schools and your experience at Bates, which of these changes sticks? How are we going to see this process, change and evolve over time? I know that's a loaded question, perhaps, but I'm curious to know, what are people going to hold on to?
Sure. So I think the virtual opportunities are not going to go away. We were really sluggish, and that's being generous as a industry, if I'm allowed to say that, but as institutions of higher education, we were very sluggish to move from any sort of in-person interactions, whether that meant having visitors on our campus, us going to high schools, the whole 9 yards. And so I can't see the virtual offerings going away. I think we're all hopeful that in-person interactions will reoccur, but these two will live in harmony with one another and supplement each other. When we think about it from an access perspective, the fact that students do not have to trek it to Maine or Georgia or Missouri, and can get essentially the full spectrum of experiences. Is it going to supplement walking around campus and bumping into a random student? No, but they can get, I'd say 80+% of it done pretty well. It's not mathematically tied to anything, but they can get a solid sense of the place virtually. So I don't see that going away. I think Bates, yes, being a pioneer in the test optional movement, I'm hopeful for the good of the work that we do as educators, that the movement towards test optional across the country, you're seeing it at every level of institution, size, selectivity, program. I'm hopeful that that remains. So many institutions are doing it as a pilot. It might be for 1 year, 2 years, or even 3 years. I'm curious to see where the test-free movement goes, and how that may or may not take off. But we've been able for, again, over 35 years at Bates to enroll fantastic students who go on to do stellar things across the globe. And those numbers, as we put it, that one Saturday morning, or dare I say 2 or 3 in the past, is not indicative of who they are as a learner or a whole person. So I'm hopeful that remains. I could go on, but I'm sure Renee and Rick have some awesome insights.
I can take something that may not be admission related as much as it is enrollment related. I think that, this hybrid model of teaching and being able to deliver classes, is also something that is largely here to stay. It's going to look different from place to place. That's naturally. I mean, just like we all do some things a little bit differently, but to give you an example of this, I mean, University of Florida, for years now, one of the ways they've been able to grow is that they've had students do at least one of their 3 first terms online, and so that's allowed them to boost enrollment, but not have quite the hit on the auxiliaries of campus, right? I definitely think that not all schools are going to go to that model, but I think a lot of schools are going to go to the model of being able to have, some students that are receiving education, in this hybrid fashion. We had flipped the classroom, right, already in a lot of ways to promote better discussion and to capitalize on these amazing faculty members and the opportunity to really dig into the material more than just deliver the material. And I think those are the type of changes that we're all figuring out and discovering through COVID that are going to have various permutations, but be part of higher education for the future. More so across the board than they've been fits and starts to this point in the landscape.
If I could add, and I don't have a prediction as to where this lands, but I'm most curious to see where college athletics lands. I shouldn't say most, but I'm curious to see where college athletics lands. And you have here tonight, Division III to Division I, and I'm saying this as a former scholar athlete in college. It's a big piece, or it can be a big piece of the experience for many students, and a big piece of the campus community. So that's something that I think is also in the landscape.
Yeah, and Leigh, I actually, speaking to that point, I wonder if you would maybe address how the pandemic in the more short term, the immediate future, has impacted athletic recruitment. It seems from our perspective, some of our prospective student athletes lack clarity at this point in the process that they may have had in previous years. Are your coaches able to recruit with clarity, and how has this changed that process?
Sure. So I think that'll vary institution to institution, division to division, conference to conference. So I just want to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the NESCAC right now. So Bates participates in the New England Small Colleges Athletic Conference, which is arguably the most competitive D3 conference. Right now for Bates, though, we've given our coaches the charge to proceed as ordinary. So we're optimistic that we will be able to field 31 teams next fall or next academic year. And as we've talked about enrollment, we started off talking about how the three of us are thinking about next year's first year class. And it doesn't sound like any of us are dialing back. If anything, we might be pushing upward. We don't want, from a broad enrollment perspective, peaks and valleys are never what an institution hopes for. So as Rick and Renee have said, we're living in the land of uncertainty, and athletics provides certainty. And to not only manage to peaks and valleys in a first year class, to then have to manage to peaks and valleys in rosters, getting you way into the particulars here, but I've just said to our coaches, we can't be rebuilding 31 rosters a year from now. That's just not possible. So we're proceeding as planned. Our coaches are proceeding as planned. And so if you are a student athlete and that's something you're excited about, would encourage you to reach out to a coach. It'll be interesting though to see, we're typically early decision is where we've seen the bevy of athletic activity, but we'll see if some students want to hang a little bit longer in hopes that maybe they can visit a campus or have an in-person interaction with a coach.
And Ronne or Rick, I wonder if you anticipate, a different scenario at either of your institutions.
Yeah, I don't, at Wash U, I'm not seeing a different scenario. Our coaches are recruiting virtually. I mean, they're not traveling, which I think is hard for them. They would travel and watch athletes and those sorts of things. But they are still recruiting. They're still forwarding athletes to us to get an early read. Our teams aren't competing right now. Our conference, the UAA, they're not competing, but they are. There's some teams that are practicing, and they're just working to recruit. The coaches know, they understand their rosters and they understand the talent that they're looking for, and they're trying to do that, and they're trying to work closely with us to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, fairly similar. I mean, the ACC is currently playing football, and we are, right now, I mean, obviously a lot of this is coming down to what the winter and spring are going to look like with some of our student athletes, I think, as it relates to their eligibility, and also as it relates to, in some cases, pro prospects, or even, leaving the country to play their sport, at other places. So it's definitely, it is in some ways business as usual. We're signing pre-certs, we're moving forward through the NCAA process, but I do think it's a bit too early to know exactly how this is going to play out sport by sport, because I think probably you're going to see some very different behavior from our student athletes. The question is that going to just be on the margins and nobody's really going to know, or could there be some kind of a big change in pattern or behavior? I think it's just a little too early to know that.
Well, I'm hearing the church bells across the street ringing, which means we are at the hour. I don't necessarily want to put any of you on the spot, but I'm wondering if any of you have parting words of advice or anything that you've wanted to say to prospective families through the course of this season, which we know is just different than it's been in years past. We so appreciate your time and perspective. So if there's any parting words of advice that you can offer, we'd be grateful for that as well.
Go ahead, Renee.
I was just going to say, and I said it earlier, I think it's really important that students and families relax, and I think there's lots of reason for optimism, and we are going to work with you and be flexible in the admissions process. We have to be, and I think you just trust that and work with your counselors. But I wish you all the best.
One thing I've learned, we have 4 boards up now. We are back in the office. Our staff is back in the office a day a week. And so I'm generally going in on Fridays, and so we're in teams, each day. And I put these whiteboards up in the hall. One is silver linings. One is lessons learned. One is never go back. don't do it the way we used to. And the other is keep forever. So even when we come out of COVID, let's keep doing this. And Leigh and Ronne have both enumerated a couple of those kind of things. And it's been cool to come in on Fridays because a whole week goes by, where people are writing stuff up, and then you see new thoughts and new ideas. And I guess one of the things I would say is I've learned a lot, I think also kind of through our students this year, I used to say that students controlled 2/3 of the admission process. They control where they apply, they don't control where they get in. And then if they do their job well, and you guys are doing your job well in counseling them, they get to pick where they go, right? Maybe some got taken off the table, but at the end of the day, they pick that. What this year has taught me is they actually control 3/4 of the process. It's actually, instead of 66% of the pie, it's actually more like 75%, because a really important one at the end is your attitude when you show up wherever that is. And so, these kids that are now on these college campuses, right? They chose where they applied. They didn't choose where they get in. They chose where they wanted to go. And then they decided how they were going to show up, right? They're going to be all in on this. They're going to build a new community. They're going to make the best of it. And while COVID is a whole different type of make the best of it, we all have to make that choice in our jobs. We have to make that choice in our families. We have to make that choice as college freshmen. I'm going to make the best of this. And so I'm encouraging seniors to not just look at point to point, now to May 1st, but now to next year, October of next year. You don't know where you're going to be. Can't control that completely right now, but you can control like getting your mind right and getting your mentality right. And I think control is one of those things during COVID that we're all feeling so much that we have lack of. But to think about, hey, I got 75% of control. I think most of us, most days, would take 75% of control in this world we're living in.
The only thing I would add is, and this might sound funny to folks, but in some ways I wish I could actually dial back to mid-March or early April when the world stopped and everything was quiet. And so I've felt myself ramping up. I felt Bates ramping up. I felt my family ramping up, 7 months into this. And so I just try to take time every day to like shut my screen down, shut my phones off, and it's Maine, go outside, get in the woods. So whatever that was for you, where the world just kind of stopped, as scary and unsettling as it was, I think there was also a wonderful calm to that, that allowed people to focus on what really was important to them. So I don't want to be all cliche and say less is more, or, do what's authentically important to you, but just go back to that slowness and that quiet if you can, because I think there'll be a time where that's really in the distance and we can't all remember it. And there was real value to that experience.
Well, I can't express how grateful we are for your time and for your expertise. I don't take for granted how busy you are and how busy this time of year is. So on behalf of our office, our school community, and certainly our parent population as well, thank you all so much for being with us. And with that, I guess our Dean's panel is concluded. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to direct those to your college counselor or certainly to me as well. So thank you all and have a wonderful night.